A 30-year-old virgin traded to a mountain man for her father's debt. She never expected to find love. The saloon doors slam. Dice roll. A desperate father shoves his only daughter forward, sold like property. The crowd laughs. But one man steps from the shadows, scarred by war, a mountain giant who claims her life, not to own, but to protect. High in the snowbound wilderness, she finds a rough-hewn cabin and a secret no one told her. A half-Apache boy hiding by the fire, caught between two worlds, and now part of hers. Whispers of marriage stir, but danger rides fast. A sheriff with papers, a gambler with blood debts, a railroad hungry for land. And the father who betrayed her returns, demanding what he claims is his. When the law and the land itself rise against them, will this woman find the courage to fight for family and faith? Or will she lose everything, her freedom, the boy's future, and the one chance at love she never thought she'd have? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now, and if this story speaks to you, make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Flickering lamplight cast dancing shadows on Lyda's worn dress as she guided her needle through the fabric, each stitch precise despite her trembling hands. The familiar sounds of the boarding house drifted up through the floorboards' clinking glasses, coarse laughter, and the sharp snap of cards being dealt. Her father's slurred voice rose above the din, making her wince. The boarding house room felt especially shabby tonight. A threadbare quilt covered her narrow bed, and the wallpaper peeled at the corners like autumn leaves ready to fall. Lyda paused in her mending, her ears straining as angry voices erupted from below. "You owe me $500, old man." The card sharp's voice cut through the usual tavern noise. "Pay up or there'll be trouble." Curiosity pulled Lyda from her chair. She crept to the doorframe, her heart pounding against her ribs. The rough wooden boards creaked beneath her feet as she leaned forward to listen. "Ain't got that kind of money," her father drawled, his words thick with whiskey. "But I got something better." A moment of silence followed, broken by the scrape of chair legs on the floor. Lyda's fingers gripped the doorframe until her knuckles turned white. "Take my daughter instead." Her father's words struck like a physical blow. "She's 30, but still fresh enough. Worth more than what I owe." Cruel laughter rippled through the crowd. Boots thundered up the stairs, and before Lyda could retreat, rough hands seized her arms. She found herself dragged down to the saloon floor, her cheeks burning with shame as every eye turned to study her like cattle at auction. The card sharp circled her, his lips curled in a sneer. "Bit long in the tooth for my taste." He prodded her shoulder with a finger. "And scrawny, too." More jeers followed, each word a thorn in her heart. Lyda stared at the sawdust-covered floor, fighting back tears. She'd known her father was a worthless drunk, but this betrayal cut deeper than she'd thought possible. "I'll claim her." The deep voice rolled like distant thunder through the suddenly quiet room. The crowd parted as a tall figure stepped from the shadows. Lyda looked up and up at the mountain man who'd spoken. His face was partially hidden by a thick beard, but his eyes were clear and steady as they met hers. Unlike the other men in the saloon, his gaze held no mockery or greed. "Ethan Grant?" someone whispered. "The hermit from up high?" The mountain man ignored the mutters. He moved with the deliberate grace of a wild creature, stopping a respectful distance from Lyda. "I'll settle the debt," he said, "but not to own her. No person should be traded like property." He removed his hat, revealing dark hair streaked with silver at the temples. The gesture transformed him from a fearsome figure to something gentler, though no less imposing. "Miss Whitcomb," he said, his voice pitched for her ears alone, "I offer you safe passage from here." "The choice is yours." Lyda's mind whirled. She knew nothing of this man except his name and the whispered stories of a Civil War veteran who'd chosen solitude in the mountains. Yet, as she looked into his steady gaze, she saw something that had been missing from her life for so long: dignity. "I'll go with you," she whispered, her voice stronger than she felt. Ethan nodded once, then turned to the card sharp. He pulled a leather pouch from his coat and counted out coins onto a nearby table. The sharp chink of metal on wood seemed to echo in the hushed room. "Your debt is paid," Ethan announced to her father, who swayed on his feet, already focused on his next drink. He didn't even look at Lydia as she gathered her shawl and the small bag containing her few possessions. Within minutes, Lydia found herself seated in Ethan's wagon, a lantern swaying gently from the side. The night air was cool on her heated cheeks as they left the town behind. She sat rigid on the wooden seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, trying to still their trembling. The steady clip-clop of the horses' hooves and the creak of wagon wheels filled the silence. Shadows deepened as they moved away from the town's lights, the vast expanse of star-filled sky spreading above them like a blanket of diamonds on black velvet. Lydia stole glances at her companion's profile, wondering what fate awaited her in the high country with this quiet giant of a man who'd shown her more kindness in one gesture than she'd known in years. First rays of dawn painted the sky in soft pinks and golds as the wagon creaked its way up the mountain road. Each turn revealed steeper climbs ahead, the path narrowing until branches brushed against the canvas cover. Lydia shifted on the hard wooden seat, her muscles stiff from the night's journey. The thin blanket wrapped around her shoulders did little to ward off the morning chill. She stole another glance at Ethan Grant's profile. In the growing light, she could better see the scars that marked the left side of his face, pale lines that disappeared into his beard. His expression remained as unchanging as the mountains themselves, his eyes fixed on the winding trail ahead. The wagon wheels hit a particularly deep rut, jolting them both. Lydia grabbed the seat's edge to steady herself, her knuckles white with the effort. Without a word, Ethan reached behind the seat and produced a battered tin cup. He poured steaming coffee from a pot that had been warming near his feet. "It'll help with the cold," he said, his voice rough from disuse. When she hesitated, he added, "It's bitter, but hot." Lydia accepted the cup with trembling fingers, careful not to brush his hand. The coffee was indeed bitter, but the warmth spread through her chest like a blessing. She noticed her blankets had slipped, revealing the small bundle of possessions beneath. "Keep your blankets close," Ethan said, not looking at her. "Nights get cold up here, even in summer." The morning wore on in silence until they reached a particularly steep stretch. Ethan cleared his throat. "No woman is property in my house." The words seemed to cost him effort, as if he wasn't used to speaking his mind. "You'll have your own space, your own choices." Lydia clutched the empty coffee cup, studying his expression for any sign of deception. She found none. His eyes remained steady on the trail, but there was a gentleness in how he handled the reins, in how he'd offered her coffee without demand or expectation. As evening approached, Ethan guided the wagon off the main trail toward the sound of running water. They made camp near a clear stream that tumbled over moss-covered rocks. The horses nickered softly as Ethan unhitched them, while Lydia stood uncertain by the wagon, watching him work. "There's flour in the wagon box," he said, shouldering an axe. "Cornbread would go well with the dried venison, if you've a mind to make it." He paused. "Only if you wish to." Lydia found herself nodding. Cooking was familiar ground, something she could control in this strange new world. She located the small sack of flour while Ethan disappeared into the trees. Soon the rhythmic sound of chopping echoed through the gathering dusk. She mixed the cornbread with practiced hands, using the stream water and a pinch of salt she found wrapped in paper. A cast-iron skillet hung from the wagon's side, and she had it heating over the small fire by the time Ethan returned with an onload of split wood. The howl of coyotes echoed in the distance as they shared a simple meal of cornbread and venison. Ethan ate quickly but neatly, keeping a respectful distance on his side of the fire. When Lydia finished her portion, He offered her more without pressing. When she declined, night settled around them like a heavy blanket. Lita arranged her bedroll near the fire, close enough for warmth, but not so near as to be improper. The flames cast dancing shadows on the wagon's canvas cover, and overhead, stars glittered like scattered diamonds on black velvet. Ethan settled himself on a fallen log, his musket laid across his knees. "I'll take first watch," he said quietly. "Sleep if you can. We've another long day tomorrow." Lita lay down, pulling her blankets tight around her shoulders. The fire's warmth and the stream's gentle music should have been soothing, but sleep felt distant. Still, she realized with some surprise that fear wasn't what kept her awake. Rather, it was the strangeness of feeling safer than she had in years. Despite being alone in the wilderness with a man she barely knew, she watched Ethan's still form through half-closed eyes. His scarred face was turned toward the darkness beyond their camp, alert but not tense. The musket rested easily in his calloused hands, not threatening, but ready to protect. Lita turned her gaze to the star-filled sky above. "Lord," she whispered, her voice barely a breath, "grant me courage for whatever lies ahead, and thank you for sending someone who sees me as a person, not property." The prayer settled something in her heart, though questions still swirled like leaves in an autumn wind. The coyotes called again, their voices closer now, but Lita found she wasn't afraid. Ethan's solid presence and the crackling fire formed a circle of safety in the vast wilderness. She remained cautious. Life had taught her the wisdom of that, but for the first time since leaving town, she felt the knot of tension in her chest begin to loosen. The afternoon sun hung low in the western sky as the wagon wound its way up the final stretch of mountain trail. Lita's back ached from the long journey, but she sat straighter as Ethan drew the horses to a halt. There, nestled against a backdrop of towering pines, stood a sturdy log cabin. A small pasture stretched to one side, its split-rail fence weathered gray by sun and snow. "Home," Ethan said simply, guiding the team forward. The cabin looked solid and well-maintained, if modest. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, which struck Lita as odd. They'd been on the trail all day, so who had tended the fire? Before she could ponder this further, Ethan helped her down from the wagon, his calloused hands steady but careful not to linger. "Let's get inside while I see to the horses," he said, already moving to unhitch the team. Lita climbed the 3 rough-hewn steps to the cabin's door. The wooden planks felt solid beneath her feet, free of the rot that had plagued her father's boarding house. When she pushed the door open, the scent of wood smoke and cedar wrapped around her like a familiar blanket. The interior was dim but tidy, with a stone hearth dominating one wall and simple furnishings scattered about a table. Chairs, a cupboard with tin plates gleaming in the fading light. Her eyes fell on the table, where 2 wooden bowls sat waiting. Something flickered in her chest, uncertainty, perhaps fear. Had Ethan been less than truthful? Did he share this home with someone else? A small sound drew her attention to the hearth. There, half hidden in the shadows, stood a child. A boy, no more than 8 years old, with skin the warm brown of summer earth and eyes dark as mountain pools. His black hair fell in straight strands across his forehead, and he wore clean but well-worn clothes that seemed a size too large. The door creaked open behind her as Ethan entered. The boy immediately darted from his hiding place, pressing himself against Ethan's leg like a scared fawn seeking shelter. Ethan's large hand came to rest gently on the child's shoulder. "Thomas," he said softly, kneeling down to the boy's level. "This is Miss Whitcomb. She's come to stay with us." He glanced up at Lita, something almost like uncertainty in his eyes. "Miss Whitcomb, this is Thomas." Lita felt her surprise give way to understanding. This, then, was why there had been 2 bowls. She offered what she hoped was a warm smile, though her heart was racing at this unexpected development. "Hello, Thomas," she said quietly. The boy didn't respond, just pressed closer to Ethan, his small fingers gripping the man's worn leather vest. Rather than scold him for his shyness, Ethan simply patted his back with a tenderness that made Lita's throat tight. "There's stew keeping warm," Ethan said, rising. Thomas helped prepare it before we arrived. They settled around the table, Thomas still watching Lita with wary eyes. The stew was simple, but filling chunks of venison with wild onions and the last of what must have been winter's preserved vegetables. As they ate, Ethan spoke more than he had during their entire journey. "Found him about 6 months back," he explained, his voice low. "Freight wagon accident down in the valley. Bad business. No survivors except Thomas here." He paused, stirring his stew. His mother was Apache. Father was a traitor. No legal claim to him, but couldn't leave him to the agencies. The way he said it made it clear what he thought of such places. Lita watched. Thomas, carefully spooning his stew, noticed how his shoulders had relaxed slightly as Ethan spoke. The boy's loneliness was a tangible thing, as familiar to her as her own reflection. She recognized in his careful movements the same wariness she'd carried since childhood, the fear of being unwanted, cast aside. After the bowls were cleared and cleaned, Ethan led her to a ladder against the far wall. It rose to a small loft space beneath the peaked roof. "Your room," he said. "It ain't much, but it's private. Thomas and I sleep down here." Lita climbed up to inspect her new quarters. The space was small but clean, with a narrow bed tucked under the eaves. A small window looked out over the pasture, and someone had placed a bunch of dried wildflowers in a tin can on the windowsill. The gesture, unexpected in this bachelor household, made her eyes sting with sudden tears. Looking down from her perch, she could see Thomas helping Ethan lay out bedrolls near the hearth. The boy moved with the quiet efficiency of long practice, while Ethan's movements were careful, gentle, always aware of the child's presence. They had built their own kind of peace here in the mountains, these two lost souls. Now, Lita wondered what her presence would mean for their fragile household. Morning crept into the cabin through narrow gaps between the logs, painting thin stripes of golden light across the rough-hewn floor. Lita stirred in her loft bed, momentarily confused by the unfamiliar creaking of timber and the sharp scent of pine. The events of yesterday flooded back as she caught the mingled aromas of wood smoke and sizzling bacon drifting up from below. She smoothed her wrinkled dress and pinned her hair as best she could before descending the ladder. Ethan stood at the hearth, turning bacon in a cast-iron skillet while Thomas set out tin plates with careful precision. The boy glanced up at her approach, but quickly looked away, his shoulders tensing slightly. "Morning," Ethan nodded, his voice gruff but not unkind. "Hope you slept well enough." "Yes, thank you," Lita replied, hovering uncertainly near the table. The domestic scene before her felt strange, the silent man and wary child going about their morning routine. Breakfast was a quiet affair. Ethan served thick slices of bacon alongside Johnny cakes drizzled with honey. The food was simple but filling, though the silence stretched between them like a heavy blanket. Lita found herself studying her companions, Ethan's scarred hands as he broke his Johnny cake into careful pieces, Thomas's quick darting glances when he thought no one was watching. After the meal, Lita stepped outside, eager to explore her new surroundings in the clear morning light. The yard spread out before her, bordered by tall pines that whispered in the mountain breeze. A sturdy goat pen stood to one side, where a black and white nanny goat watched her with suspicious yellow eyes. Beyond that, a massive woodpile stretched along the cabin's western wall, split logs stacked neat and high against winter's coming need. Near the cabin's corner, she discovered a hand-dug well, its stone walls disappearing into cool darkness. The wooden bucket hung ready, rope weathered but strong. Everything spoke of careful preparation, of a life carved deliberately from the wilderness. Heavy boots scuffed behind her. Ethan stood there, his tall frame blocking the morning sun. "Miss Whitcomb," he said, his voice measured. "Need to ask your intentions." He shifted, uncomfortable but determined. "If you wish to return to town, I'll take you. No shame in that choice." Lita's throat tightened as memories of the saloon crashed over her. The jeering faces, her father's casual cruelty, years of barely contained contempt. Here, at least, she had been treated with dignity. "I would like to stay," she said quietly but firmly. "If you will have me." Ethan studied her face for a long moment, then nodded once. "Reckon we could use the help," he said. "There's plenty needs doing." As if to prove his point, he showed her to the goat pen. "Nanny needs milking morning and night," he explained, demonstrating the technique with practiced hands. Lita watched carefully, then took his place on the milking stool. Her first attempts were clumsy, but the goat proved patient, and soon a steady stream of milk pinged against the bucket's tin bottom. Throughout the morning, Lita threw herself into learning the rhythm of mountain life. She swept the cabin's plank floor, gathered eggs from the small henhouse, and helped Thomas carry water from the well. The boy remained silent, but she noticed him watching as she hummed an old hymn while working. By midday, he had crept closer, though he still kept Ethan between them like a shield. As evening settled over the mountains, Lita sat in a chair near the hearth, while Thomas perched on a low stool nearby. The lamplight cast dancing shadows on the walls as she began telling him the story of David and Goliath. She kept her voice soft and gentle, watching his dark eyes grow wide at the tale of the shepherd boy's courage. Across the room, Ethan worked at the table, his strong hands repairing worn leather harness straps. Though he seemed focused on his task, Lita noticed how he tilted his head slightly toward her voice, catching every word. When she described David's faith in the face of overwhelming odds, Ethan's hands stilled briefly before resuming their steady work. Thomas leaned forward as the story reached its climax, his usual wariness forgotten in the drama of the moment. When Lita finished, he remained quiet, but didn't immediately retreat to his usual spot near Ethan. Instead, he stayed where he was, watching the flames dance in the hearth, perhaps seeing giants and shepherd boys in the shifting light. The evening wrapped around them like a warm shawl, this odd collection of souls brought together by chance and choice. Outside, a whippoorwill called into the gathering dusk, its lonely song echoing off the mountainside. Inside the cabin, three people who had been alone yesterday began the careful work of becoming something else, something that might, with time and trust, resemble a family. The days flowed one into another like water over smooth stones. Lita found her hands growing stronger, her movements more certain as she learned the rhythms of mountain life. Morning light would find her at the cook stove, afternoon sun warming her back as she worked in the yard, and evenings brought the comfort of lamplight and shared meals. She discovered torn shirts tucked away in corners, suggesting Ethan's pride had kept him from asking for help. Without comment, she began mending them, her neat stitches closing ragged holes and reinforcing worn seams. The first time Ethan put on a repaired shirt, he nodded his thanks, a ghost of a smile touching his weathered face. "Reckon I ought to show you something useful in return," he said one crisp morning. He led her to a clearing where slender saplings grew, demonstrating how to split them for kindling. The axe felt awkward in her hands at first, but Ethan was patient, adjusting her grip until she found the right rhythm. "Like this?" she asked, bringing the axe down with more confidence. "That's the way," he approved, watching as the wood split clean and true. Even the mishaps brought unexpected joy. The old nanny goat, growing bolder with familiarity, caught Lita's skirt one afternoon while she hung washing on the line. The creature tugged playfully, dark eyes mischievous. Lita's startled laugh rang out across the yard, surprising herself as much as the goat. From the cabin door, she caught Ethan watching, his expression thoughtful. He proved to be a patient teacher in other ways too. One morning, he showed her how to set snares for rabbits, his calloused hands gentle as they shaped the wire. "No sense relying on just my hunting," he explained. "Winter's coming. Need every means of providing we can manage." The afternoon sun had warmed the air when Lita went to check the wash drying by the creek. Thomas appeared silently beside her, his small feet barely disturbing the grass. He helped her fold the stiff sheets, his movements careful and precise. "Miss Lita?" His voice was so quiet she almost missed it. "Yes, Thomas?" He twisted the corner of a sheet between his fingers, eyes fixed on the ground. He swallowed hard. "Do you reckon you might want to be my mama?" The question caught her heart like a fishhook. Tears pricked her eyes as she knelt before him, the sheet forgotten. Here was this precious child, carrying so much loss, offering her the most sacred of titles. "Oh, Thomas," she whispered, opening her arms. He fell into them like a sapling finally finding support, his thin shoulders trembling. "I would be honored to be your mama." She held him close, breathing in the scent of pine needles and boy that clung to his shirt. A slight movement caught her eye. Ethan stood at the edge of the clearing, his expression unguarded for once. Something soft and yearning crossed his face before he turned away, leaving them their private moment. That evening, as shadows lengthened across the cabin floor, they gathered for supper. Steam rose from bowls of rabbit stew, the meat tender from long simmering with wild carrots and herbs. Thomas had helped her gather the vegetables, proud to show her which plants were good for eating. Before they began, Lita folded her hands and bowed her head. For the first time since arriving, she spoke grace aloud. "Dear Lord, we thank you for this food, for the shelter of this home, and for bringing us together as..." She hesitated only a moment. "As family. Amen." She glimpsed Ethan's rough hands twitching slightly, as if unused to the gesture of prayer. Thomas's small fingers were steadier, clasped tight with the earnestness of childhood faith. A soft whisper drew her to the window after the meal. The season's first snow was falling, early this year according to Ethan's furrowed brow. Fat flakes drifted down like feathers, frosting the pine branches with delicate white. The gathering storm should have brought worry. She knew enough now about mountain winters to understand their danger. Yet as she watched the snow transform their small world, Lita felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the crackling hearth. Thomas pressed against her side, his small hand finding hers as they watched the white curtain fall. Behind them, Ethan moved quietly, banking the fire for the night. The storm was coming, yes, but they would face it together. This cabin that had seemed so strange just days ago now felt like sanctuary. These people who had been strangers were becoming something else, something precious and real, like the first green shoots that would push through snow when spring returned to the mountains. The snow came in waves, transforming the mountain into a white wilderness. Drifts piled against the cabin walls, and icicles hung like crystal spears from the eaves. The world beyond their small clearing disappeared beneath nature's thick blanket. One bright morning, Ethan emerged from the storage shed, carrying 2 pairs of snowshoes. The wooden frames were well worn but sturdy, the rawhide webbing carefully maintained. "Time you learned," he said, holding out the smaller pair to Lita. "Can't stay cooped up all winter." Lita eyed the strange contraptions dubiously. "I'll sink right through. That's the point of these. You won't." Ethan knelt, helping her strap the snowshoes over her boots. Thomas watched from the doorway, wrapped in a wool blanket, his dark eyes bright with anticipation. Her first steps were ungainly, like a newborn colt finding its legs. The snowshoes seemed determined to tangle with each other, sending her pitching forward. Ethan's strong hand caught her elbow, steadying her. "Wider stance," he instructed. "Walk natural. Just lift your feet a bit higher. Thomas's giggles rang out across the snow-hushed yard as Lida wobbled and flailed. "You look like a duck, Miss Lida." She laughed despite herself, cheeks flushed with cold and embarrassment. "I suppose I do." Gradually, with Ethan's patient guidance, she found her rhythm. Soon she was able to follow him in a wide circle around the cabin, the snowshoes making soft shushing sounds against the powder. The winter air nipped at her face, but her blood was warm from the exercise. The short days meant long evenings indoors. They would gather by the hearth after supper, Thomas playing with wooden animals Ethan had carved, while Lida mended or knitted by firelight. Sometimes the silence felt comfortable, like a warm blanket drawn around them all. One such night, as wind moaned through the pines outside, Ethan spoke unexpectedly. "Was at Gettysburg," he said, his voice low. "Third day." Pickett's charge. Lida's hands stilled in her lap as he continued, haltingly at first, then with growing openness. He spoke of the horror of that bloody day, of carrying wounded comrades from the field, of the nightmares that still haunted him. His fingers traced the scar that ran from temple to jaw, a permanent reminder of grape shot that nearly took his life. Couldn't abide crowds after, he admitted. Noise. People pressing close. Came to these mountains to find peace. His eyes met hers briefly. Found solitude instead. Until Thomas. Lida listened with quiet compassion, understanding better now his need for space, his careful movements, his preference for silence. When he fell quiet, she shared her own pain, how the townspeople had whispered behind their hands as she grew older without marrying. "Unwanted, they called me," she said softly. "Too plain, too quiet. Too fond of books instead of parties. My father," she swallowed hard, "he never let me forget I was a burden." "You ain't unwanted here," Ethan said firmly. Thomas, who had been listening quietly, nodded emphatic agreement as the days passed. Laughter came more easily to their little household. Ethan showed her how to play checkers, while Thomas delighted in moving the pieces when neither was looking. They shared stories over meals, Ethan's dry humor emerging in tales of mountain life, Lida's quiet wit and remembrances of childhood adventures. One evening, with snow falling thick outside, Leah sang as she worked on a quilt. The hymn rose sweet and clear in the firelit cabin. Amazing grace. How sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. Thomas gravitated to her side, settling against her skirts. His small hand curled in the fabric as his eyes grew heavy. By the third verse, his head rested in her lap, breaths deep and even in sleep. Lida's voice softened but didn't stop. Her fingers stroked Thomas's dark hair as she sang, the familiar words carrying all her gratitude for this unexpected blessing of belonging. When she glanced up, she found Ethan watching them from his chair by the fire. The flames reflected in his eyes, but there was something else there too, a brightness that might have been tears. His usual guardedness had fallen away, revealing a tenderness that caught at her heart. For a long moment, they held each other's gaze across the sleeping child between them, while outside the winter wind sang its own wild hymn through the mountain pines. The late winter sun hung low in the afternoon sky as Ethan secured the last pack rope on his mule. Supplies had dwindled dangerous low, the flour barrel nearly empty, coffee beans down to a handful, and salt pork running scarce. A trip to town could not be delayed any longer. Lita stood in the doorway, arms wrapped around herself against the chill. Thomas pressed against her skirts, his small fingers clutching the fabric. The boy had not left her side since Ethan announced his journey that morning. 2 days, Ethan said, checking the cinch one final time. 3 at most if the snow's deep in the pass. He straightened, meeting Lida's worried gaze. "You know how to prime the rifle?" She nodded. He had taught her weeks ago, patient hands guiding hers through a loading process. "Yes, though I pray I won't need it. Just in case," he said quietly. Keep Thomas close. Don't answer any knocks. The mule shifted restlessly as Ethan mounted. Thomas darted forward suddenly, reaching up. Don't go. Ethan leaned down, rough hand gentle on the boy's head. Watch over Miss Lita for me, son. I'm counting on you. They stood watching until horse and rider disappeared around the bend, leaving only tracks in the crusty snow. The mountain seemed vastly empty without Ethan's steady presence. That first night, Lita kept the fire burning bright. She and Thomas huddled close, sharing stories to fill the strange silence. The boy fell asleep in her lap as she stroked his dark hair, listening to the wind moan through the pines. The cabin felt different without Ethan, bigger and lonelier, as if the shadows stretched longer in his absence. The second day crawled by. They did their usual chores, feeding the goats, hauling water, sweeping the packed dirt floor. But every sound made them start, eyes flying to the window. By evening, Lita's nerves were stretched thin with waiting. Just before sunset on the third day, they heard the familiar clip-clop of hooves. Thomas ran to the door, while Lita's heart leaped with relief. But when Ethan stepped into the lamplight, her joy faltered. His face was drawn, shoulders tense with some heavy burden. What's wrong? She asked, helping him shed his snow-crusted coat. He didn't answer until after supper, when Thomas was occupied with his wooden toys by the hearth. Had trouble in town, he said in low tones. Sheriff Tully stopped me. Lita's hand stilled in her mending. What did he want? Government's pushing to gather up mixed-blood children. Send them to that new Indian school down south. Ethan's jaw clenched. Sheriff says they'll be coming for Thomas soon. No. The word burst from her before she could stop it. Thomas looked up, startled by her vehemence. That's not all, Ethan continued grimly. Your father's been making noise. Claims you're still his legal ward. Says I kidnapped you. His scarred face was shadowed with worry. Sheriff seemed mighty interested in that part. Fear knotted in Lita's stomach, bitter as gall. The thought of being forced back to her father's custody, of Thomas torn away to some distant school, it was too terrible to contemplate. They can't, she whispered. They can't take us. I won't let them. Ethan's voice was fierce with conviction, but she heard the undertone of doubt. What could one man do against the law? Thomas abandoned his toys and climbed into Lita's lap, as if sensing her distress. She held him close, breathing in the familiar scent of pine soap and wood smoke in his hair. This is our home, she said softly. Our family. Ethan stoked the fire, sending sparks dancing up the chimney. But the law don't always see what's right in front of it. They sat long after supper, the fire burning lower and lower. Thomas dozed against Lita's shoulder while she and Ethan spoke in hushed tones, weighing options that seemed to grow slimmer by the minute. The sheriff might come tomorrow, or next week, or next month, but he would come. Ethan's hand clenched on his knee. Could try running. Head deeper into the mountains. In winter? With a child? Lita shook her head. And they'd never stop hunting us. The fire crackled and popped, throwing weird shadows on the walls. Outside, an owl called mournfully through the darkness. Lita felt the weight of Thomas in her arms, the warmth of him, the trust in his peaceful sleep. She looked at Ethan across the hearth and saw her own fear reflected in his eyes. Fear not for themselves, but for this precious thing they had found, this family bound not by blood, but by choice and love. They had no answers that night, no clever solutions to ward off the threats gathering like storm clouds on their horizon. All they could do was draw closer together, taking comfort in each other's presence while they still could, bracing for a fight that seemed impossible to win. Dawn broke over the mountains, painting the snow-capped peaks in rose gold. Lita rose early, determined to prove her worth to this makeshift family. The threat of separation had lit a fire in her belly, pushing her to master every skill needed for mountain life in the kitchen, She mixed flour and yeast with practiced hands. The dough felt alive beneath her fingers as she kneaded it, working in her prayers with each fold. The cabin filled with the homey scent of baking bread, drawing Thomas from his bed like a moth to flame. "Can I help?" he asked, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "You can fetch more wood for the stove," she smiled, ruffling his hair. Through the window, she saw Ethan already at work, splitting logs with powerful swings of his axe. After breakfast, Lydia tackled her expanding list of chores. She fed the goats, learning their stubborn ways and individual personalities. The oldest nanny, whom Thomas had named Patches, would only be milked if Lydia sang hymns. It became their morning ritual, her voice carrying across the snow-dusted yard. "You've got away with them," Ethan observed one morning, leaning on the fence. His eyes held warmth she hadn't noticed before. Later that week, Ethan brought out his old rifle, showing her how to load and aim. "A woman alone needs to protect herself," he said, positioning her hands on the stock. The metal felt cold and foreign, but Lydia was determined to learn. They set up an old stump for target practice. Thomas perched on a fallen log, watching with wide eyes as Lydia squared her shoulders and took aim. Her first shot went wide, making her jump at the noise. The second clipped bark from the stump. Again, Ethan encouraged. "Breathe slow and squeeze gentle, like you're pulling thread." On her third try, the bullet struck dead center. Thomas leaped up, whooping with delight. "You did it, Mamalita." She lowered the rifle, cheeks flushed with pride and something more as she caught Ethan's approving nod. He'd been watching her with increasing respect these past days, seeing her not as some fragile townswoman but as a true partner in their mountain life. That Saturday evening, as they sat by the fire, Lita made a suggestion that had been growing in her mind. "There's a little church in Pine Creek Settlement," she said carefully. "Perhaps we might attend tomorrow." Ethan's face showed surprise, then consideration. "It's an hour's walk through the snow." "I'd like to go," Thomas piped up, looking between them hopefully. The next morning found them trudging through fresh powder, following a trail between towering pines. Lita wore her best dress, though it was plain compared to what she'd once owned. Thomas walked between them, holding both their hands and occasionally being swung over deeper drifts. The church was a simple log building, with a small cross mounted above the door. As they approached, Lita saw other families arriving, their curious glances making her straighten her spine. The preacher met them at the door, his welcome genuine despite the whispers that followed them to their pew. "The mountain man's got himself a woman," she heard one matron murmur. "And that Indian child," another added. Though not unkindly, Lita felt Ethan tense beside her but squeezed his arm gently. When it came time for prayer, she knelt gratefully, pouring out her heart in silent thanksgiving. "Thank you, Lord, for bringing me to this place, to these people. Thank you for turning my shame into blessing." The service was simple but touching, the familiar hymns bringing tears to her eyes. She noticed Ethan watching her as she sang, something soft and wondering in his expression. On the walk home, Thomas ran ahead, chasing snowbirds that burst from the drifts. Lydia and Ethan followed more slowly, comfortable in their shared silence. The sun had turned the snow to diamonds, each crystal catching light like precious stones. "Been thinking," Ethan said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "Years ago, before the war, I dreamed of having a wife, building a life together." He paused, searching for words. "After everything, I figured that dream was done, that I was too scarred, too changed for such things." Lydia's heart quickened, but she kept her eyes on the snowy path. "And now?" "Now I'm not so sure." His words hung in the crisp mountain air between them. Heat rose in Lydia's cheeks, and not from the cold. She didn't trust herself to speak, but she let her mittened hand brush against his as they walked. Behind them, the church bell rang out across the valley, clear and full of promise. Thomas came running back, face glowing with exercise and joy. "Race you home," he called, darting ahead again. They followed their boy through the sparkling afternoon. Their steps matched, their hearts full of unspoken possibilities. The cabin waited ahead, smoke curling from its chimney like a beacon calling them home. Morning frost glittered on the cabin windows as Ethan pulled on his heavy coat. "Running low on supplies," he announced, checking his coin purse. "Need salt for preserving and nails to fix that loose shutter." Lydia nodded, stirring the morning porridge. "We're almost out of coffee, too," she added, watching him strap on his gun belt. The weapon had become a familiar sight, though she still prayed they'd never need it. Thomas helped Ethan saddle the mule, holding the stirrup leather while the older man cinched the girth. "Can I come?" the boy asked hopefully. "Not today, son." Ethan ruffled Thomas's dark hair. "Need you here to help Lita. That water barrel needs filling before nightfall." After Ethan rode out, Lida and Thomas tackled their morning chores. The boy carried kindling while she fed the goats. The routine felt comfortable now, like a well-worn quilt. Around midday, they headed to the creek with empty buckets. Thomas splashed stones across the water while Lida filled their pails. The creek burbled peacefully, winter's ice finally giving way to spring's thaw. Then hoofbeats thundered up the trail. 2 riders emerged from the tree line. Lida's heart stopped. Her father, red-faced and swaying in his saddle, rode beside the gambler from that fateful night in the saloon. Both men reeked of whiskey, even from yards away. "There's my wayward girl," her father slurred, pointing with his bottle. "Told you she'd be here, Manning." The gambler spat tobacco juice into the snow. "Your pa owes me money, girl. You're coming with us to settle that debt." Leah grabbed Thomas's hand. "Run," she whispered urgently. They abandoned the water buckets, racing for the cabin as shouts and curses followed them up the path. Her father's horse stumbled on the rocky ground, buying them precious seconds. Inside the cabin, Lida slammed the heavy door, dropping the bar across it with trembling hands. Thomas helped her close the wooden shutters while the men's voices grew closer. "Open up, girl." Her father pounded on the door. "You're still my property by law. Go away." Lida shouted back, trying to keep her voice steady. She hustled Thomas into the back room, where Ethan kept his spare rifle. Though she'd only practiced shooting at stumps, the weapon felt reassuring in her hands. Hours crawled by. The men alternated between threats and cajolery, trying to wait them out. Thomas huddled close to Lida's side as she kept watch through a crack in the shutters. She whispered prayers and stories to keep him calm, all while straining to hear hoofbeats announcing Ethan's return. The sun had begun its westward slide when she finally heard a familiar whistle. Thomas perked up. "That's Pa Ethan's signal." Lida's heart leaped at the boy's words. Through the shutter slats, she saw Ethan riding hard up the trail, rifle raised. Her father and the gambler wheeled their horses around, startled by his sudden appearance. "Get off my land." Ethan's voice carried clear and cold as mountain air. He kept his rifle trained on the men as he dismounted. "This here's family business," her father blustered. "Girl belongs to me by right. No man owns her." Ethan's words rang with quiet authority. "She's under my protection now." The gambler reached for his gun, but Ethan's rifle clicked ominously. "I wouldn't," he warned. "I was a sharpshooter in the war. Still am." Something in his tone made both men pause. Her father took another swig from his bottle, glaring. "This ain't over. We'll be back with the sheriff. Law's on our side." "Law's changed," Ethan countered. "New territorial statute says a woman over 30 can't be held as a dependent. Lida's free to choose where she lives. Now ride out while you still can." The 2 men traded uncertain looks before turning their horses down trail, her father shouting curses until they disappeared into the trees. Only then did Lida unbar the door, her legs shaking with relief. Ethan hurried inside, checking them both for harm. "Are you hurt? Did they try to force their way in?" "We're fine," Lita assured him, though her voice quavered. Thomas was so brave. The boy hugged Ethan's leg fiercely. I helped Mama Lita bar the door. Night settled over the cabin like a heavy blanket. After Thomas fell asleep, Lita sat by the fire, unable to stop trembling as the day's events replayed in her mind. Ethan joined her, setting 2 cups of fresh coffee on the hearth. "They'll be back," she whispered, voicing her deepest fear. Ethan's weathered hand covered hers, warm and steady. "No man will take you while I breathe," he promised, his voice rough with emotion. "You're safe here, Lita, with us." She looked into his scarred face, seeing not just strength, but absolute conviction. This man who had rescued her from shame now offered something far more precious: trust, protection, maybe even love. Tears spilled down her cheeks as months of fear finally gave way to certainty. Here, with Ethan and Thomas, she had found her true home. Spring crept into the mountains like a shy fawn, melting snow in patches and coaxing green shoots from dark earth. The morning air felt softer as Lita stepped onto the cabin's front porch, breathing in the promise of warmth to come. Winter's fierce grip had finally loosened. Ethan stood in the newly cleared garden plot, showing Thomas how to drop corn seeds into shallow furrows. The boy's tongue poked out in concentration as he carefully spaced each kernel. Lita smiled at their matching serious expressions. "Reckon we'll have fresh corn by summer's end," Ethan said, patting the damp soil over the seeds. His voice held quiet pride. "Thomas here has a good eye for straight rows." The boy beamed at the praise. Lita brought them water in tin cups, pausing to admire the neat furrows they'd created. Already she could imagine tender shoots pushing through the earth, reaching for sunlight. Later that morning, Ethan and Thomas tackled the fence line, cutting fresh rails from fallen timber. Lita watched them work together, the man's patient instruction and the boy's eager mimicry warming her heart. When Thomas successfully split his first rail, his whoop of joy echoed off the mountainside. The afternoon turned warm enough for creek splashing. Thomas rolled his pants to his knees, hopping from stone to stone as minnows darted around his feet. "Look, Mama Lita," he called. "I caught one." The tiny fish wriggled in his cupped palms before slipping away. Water droplets sparkled in the sun as Thomas laughed, the sound pure and free. Lita found herself laughing too, caught up in his delight. From the bank where he mended fishing nets, Ethan's lips curved in a rare smile. The expression transformed his scarred face, softening the hard lines etched by war and wilderness. Lita caught him watching them more often now, his eyes holding something deeper than simple contentment. That evening, after a supper of rabbit stew and the last winter biscuits, Thomas tugged at Lita's sleeve. "Can we pray together?" he asked. "Not just for food, but as a family?" The word family hung in the air like music. Lita's throat tightened with emotion as she nodded. "Of course, little one. Of course, little one." They gathered by the hearth, Thomas between them. Lita began softly singing "Amazing Grace," the hymn rising clear and sweet in the cabin's quiet. Thomas joined in, his high voice weaving with hers. Then something remarkable happened. Ethan's deep baritone joined them, hesitant at first, then growing stronger. Lita's heart swelled as their voices blended in harmony. She felt Ethan's calloused hand find hers in the firelight, rough fingers intertwining with gentle certainty. The moment held such tender weight, like a wedding vow wrapped in melody rather than words. Thomas leaned against them both, completing their circle. In that precious space of time, they were truly one family, bound by choice and love rather than law. Morning brought cruel change. Hoofbeats approached as they finished breakfast. Ethan's hand went to his rifle, but the rider proved to be Jimmy Wells, a friendly face from the trading post. His expression, however, held no good news. Got papers from the territorial office, Jimmy said, handing over 2 official envelopes. Sorry to bring such trouble, Ethan. Lydia watched Ethan's face darken as he read. Thomas pressed against her skirts, sensing the sudden tension. When Ethan finally spoke, his voice was raw with anger and pain. Indian Affairs ordering Thomas to the government school in Fort Davis. He ground out. Says all half-blood children must be properly educated away from tribal influence. His hand shook as he opened the second envelope. And the railroad's filing claim on this land. Says they're putting a track through here by winter. The happiness they built shattered like glass. Lydia felt Thomas trembling and pulled him close, her own heart breaking. The boy buried his face in her apron, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. They can't take our son, she whispered fiercely, surprising herself with the possessive word. But Thomas was theirs now, in all the ways that mattered. Ethan's jaw clenched as he crumpled the papers. Government's already seized half the valley for the railroad, forcing out families who've worked this land for generations. He crossed to them in 2 strides, wrapping them both in his strong arms. I won't let them destroy what we've built here. I swear it. But Lydia heard the catch in his voice, the tremor of uncertainty beneath his determination. Their precious peace lay broken at their feet like spring frost, melting away in the harsh light of progress and law. The garden seeds they'd planted that morning felt like a mockery now. What harvest could they hope for if their family was torn apart? Fear hung heavy in the cabin like winter smoke with nowhere to escape. Lydia paced the wooden floorboards, her skirt swishing in agitation as she moved from window to window. Each crunch of leaves outside made her heart jump, dreading more riders with papers and demands. Thomas huddled by the hearth, clutching the small medicine pouch his Apache mother had left him. His dark eyes followed Lydia's movements, wide with worry. I don't want to go away, he whispered. Please don't let them take me. Never, Lydia said fiercely, gathering him close. You belong here with us. But her voice trembled on the last words. Betraying her uncertainty, Ethan stood at his usual post by the door, one hand resting on his rifle. The muscles in his jaw worked as he struggled with thoughts he wouldn't voice. Finally, he spoke low. There might be a way. If we were married proper, Lydia, you'd have legal standing as Thomas's mother. Could fight the order in territorial court. Lydia's heart stuttered. She dreamed of marriage to Ethan, but not like this. Not forced by desperation. She looked at his face, trying to read if he offered out of duty alone. I won't trap you in marriage just to save the boy, Ethan continued roughly. You deserve better than being pushed into such bonds. And if I wanted those bonds, Lydia asked softly, if I chose them freely? Before Ethan could answer, Thomas burst out. Please say yes, Mama Lydia. Then we can stay together forever. The hope in his voice nearly broke her. Lydia crossed to where Ethan stood, placing her hand on his arm. I would gladly bind myself to you, she whispered. Not from necessity, but because my heart is already yours. Ethan's eyes softened as he looked down at her, and for one precious moment, possibility bloomed between them like the first spring, flowers. But dawn brought horror instead of hope. The sound of horses and jangling tack jerked them from sleep, just as the sun's first rays touched the mountain peaks. Ethan grabbed his rifle, but Lydia saw the futility in his eyes. They couldn't fight the law with bullets. 6 mounted soldiers accompanied Sheriff Tully to their door. The sheriff's face showed no pleasure in his duty as he read the removal order, but his voice remained firm. The boy comes with us now. Government school's waiting. No. Thomas cried, clinging to Lydia's skirts. I want to stay with Mama Lydia. Lydia gathered him close, her arms tight around his small frame. He is just a child, she pleaded. Please, he needs his family. Law's the law, ma'am, Tully said. He nodded to 2 soldiers, who dismounted and approached the cabin. Ethan stepped forward, his voice dark with rage. You have no right. We have every right. Tully cut in, producing more papers. Unless you can show legal guardianship, marriage certificate, adoption papers. The silence damned them. They had nothing but love, and the law cared nothing for that. The soldiers moved efficiently, one restraining Ethan while the other pried Thomas from Lyda's desperate embrace. The boy's screams tore through the morning air as they carried him to a waiting horse. "Mama! Papa! Please don't let them take me." Lyda fought to reach him, but strong hands held her back. She could only watch, tears streaming, as they lifted Thomas into the saddle. The soldier mounted behind him, wrapping an arm around the struggling child. "Time to go, boy," Tully said quietly. "School will make a proper American of you." The group turned their horses, Thomas's cries growing fainter as they rode away. Lyda collapsed to her knees in the doorway, sobs racking her body. The empty yard seemed to mock their loss with its bright morning sunshine. Ethan stood rigid, his fists clenched so tight his knuckles showed white. When he finally moved, it was to slam his palm against the doorframe with such force the cabin shuddered. The day crawled past in horrible silence. Lyda moved like a ghost through their usual tasks, tears falling as she found Thomas's small shirt beneath his blanket, his wooden horse abandoned by the hearth. But worse than the grief was Ethan's growing distance. He spoke little, avoided her eyes, spent hours chopping wood they didn't need. When she tried to touch his arm at supper, he pulled away. Finally, as evening shadows lengthened, he spoke. "You should go, Lita, before they come for the land. No sense in you being dragged down with me. Ethan, please. I've brought nothing but pain to those I care about." He cut in harshly. "Best you leave now, while you can still make a life elsewhere." His rejection cut deeper than all her father's cruelty ever had. This man who had saved her, who had shown her what real love could be, now pushed her away in his own pain. Lita pressed her hands to her heart, feeling it crack beneath her ribs. "So you would break us apart completely?" she whispered. "Leave nothing of the family we made?" Ethan turned away, his shoulders rigid. "There's no family left to break." 2 empty days stretched like shadows across the cabin. Lyda moved through them like a ghost, her hands performing tasks her heart couldn't feel. The wooden floorboards echoed beneath her broom, each sweep a reminder of the small boots that no longer scuffed across them. She stirred cornmeal mush in the morning, though neither she nor Ethan had the spirit to eat. The cabin walls seemed to close in, haunted by Thomas's absence. His small bed lay untouched in the corner, the blanket still rumpled where he'd last slept. Lyda couldn't bear to straighten it. Instead, she kept her hands busy with endless, mindless work, anything to keep from dissolving into tears again. Ethan grew more distant with each passing hour. He rode out at dawn both days, vanishing into the hills with only his rifle for company. When he returned at dusk, his face was drawn and his eyes carried shadows deeper than any mountain valley. He barely spoke, taking his meals outside despite the spring chill. Lita watched him from the window as he cared for his horse, his movements mechanical. She recognized the guilt eating at him, the same guilt that gnawed at her own heart. If only they'd married sooner. If only they'd filed papers for Thomas. If only. The second night, she heard him pacing outside long after darkness fell. His footsteps traced the same pattern over and over, like a caged animal seeking escape. Once, she thought she heard a choked sound that might have been a sob, but when she peered out, he stood rigid against the stars, his back to the cabin. Dawn of the third day broke gray and cool. Lyda rose early, her body aching from another restless night. She found Ethan's bed empty again, the blanket barely disturbed. Fresh coffee grounds in the pot told her he'd already risen and gone out. She wrapped herself in her shawl and walked the familiar path to the north pasture. The morning dew soaked her skirtum as she followed the fence line. There she spotted him working at the far corner, replacing a broken rail. Ethan's shoulders were hunched as he worked, his movements lacking their usual sure strength. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by loss and regret. Even from a distance, Lita could see the hollow exhaustion in his face. "Ethan," she called softly. Not wanting to startle him, he glanced up briefly, then returned to his task, hammering with more force than necessary. "Fence needs mending. And what of us?" Lita asked, taking another step closer. "Will you let what we built break apart without a fight?" His hands stilled on the rail. "I've already failed you both. Failed to protect what matters most. You are not alone unless you choose to be," Lita said firmly, her voice carrying across the morning air. "Thomas needs both of us, not just as scattered pieces, but as the family we became." The hammer slipped from Ethan's grip, thudding into the spring grass. He turned to her fully then, his face raw with pain. "How can you still want any part of this? Of me?" "Because love isn't something that breaks at the first storm," she answered, closing the distance between them. "It grows stronger, like a tree that bends in the wind but doesn't fall." Her words seemed to pierce the armor of his despair. His breath caught roughly in his throat. "Lita, No more running," she interrupted, reaching for his work-roughened hand. "No more hiding in guilt. Thomas is out there somewhere, probably just as scared and lonely as we are. He needs us to be strong together." Ethan's fingers tightened around hers. "They'll fight us every step. Then we fight back," Lita declared. "Not with guns or fists, but with the truth of who we are, a family. Real and whole, no matter what papers say." They stood together in the strengthening morning light, the broken fence forgotten. Slowly, like winter ice giving way to spring, the rigid despair in Ethan's posture began to thaw. That evening, they sat close by the fire, mapping out their path forward. The flames cast warming light across their faces as they spoke of marriage licenses, custody papers, and legal battles ahead. "First light tomorrow," Ethan said, his voice carrying fresh purpose. "We ride into town. Face whatever comes together." Lita nodded, feeling hope kindle in her chest for the first time in days. "Not as broken people," she added softly, "but as a family unwilling to bow to fear." "A family," Ethan echoed, the word carrying all the weight of a vow. He reached across the space between them, taking her hand in his. This time, he didn't pull away. Outside, an owl called into the gathering darkness. But inside the cabin, the shadows held less power now. Tomorrow would bring its own battles, but they would face them standing side by side. Their love a stronger force than any law written on paper. The morning sun cast long shadows as Ethan and Lita rode into town, their horses' hooves echoing on the hard-packed dirt of Main Street. Townsfolk gathered on porches and storefronts, whispering behind raised hands as the pair made their way to the white-painted church. Inside the cool sanctuary, Lita stood tall before the assembled crowd. Her voice rang clear and strong. "I stand here of my own free will. I choose Ethan Grant as my husband, before God and these witnesses." The preacher's weathered face softened at her declaration. "Then let us join these two souls here and now." He opened his Bible. Its pages rustling in the hushed church dot from the back pew came an angry bellow. "She's my property." Lita's father lurched to his feet, face flushed with drink. "I forbid this marriage." "The law is clear," the preacher answered firmly. "A woman of age may choose her own husband. No father's permission needed." The simple ceremony proceeded despite her father's protests. When Ethan slipped a plain gold band onto Lita's finger, his hands trembled slightly, but his eyes held steady on hers. After the final prayer, Ethan pulled a worn document from his coat. "Speaking of law," he said, presenting it to the railroad agent who'd been scowling from the doorway. "This deed, signed by Apache Elder Running Fox, confirms our water rights and land boundaries. The railroad has no claim." The agent snatched the paper, face darkening as he read. With a curse, he He crumpled it and stormed out. "There's one more matter," the preacher announced. He nodded to the church door, where Thomas stood uncertainly between two Indian school officials. "This boy belongs with his parents, his real parents." "Mama!" Thomas broke free, running down the aisle. Lydia dropped to her knees, gathering him close as tears spilled down her cheeks. Ethan's strong arms encircled them both, holding his family together at last. Weeks passed, and spring's gentle warmth transformed the high valley. Tender green shoots pushed through the dark soil of their garden, reaching toward the sun. The goats bleated contentedly in their pen, while Thomas's laughter rang out as he chased butterflies in the yard. Inside the cabin, Lita stirred a pot of savory stew, the aroma filling their home. Near the hearth, Ethan worked with careful concentration, his rough hands moving with surprising gentleness as he carved intricate patterns into a wooden cradle dot at supper time. They gathered around the table, joining hands in their nightly ritual. Thomas's small fingers wrapped tightly in theirs as they bowed their heads, giving thanks aloud for their blessings. Later, they sat together on the porch beneath a vast blanket of twinkling stars. Ethan drew Lita close, his voice soft with wonder. "You weren't traded," he whispered. "You were given to me as a miracle." Tears of joy glistened in Lita's eyes as she leaned into his embrace. Thomas crawled into her lap, yawning sleepily. Their quiet laughter drifted up toward the starlit sky, carrying the promise of healing and new beginnings in their mountain home. Thanks for spending a moment here with me. If this story touched you, let's keep this connection going. Hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.